quería invitar a Marc Wachtenheim, que es el presidente de una organización co-esponsoría de esta reunión, a que nos salude.
Muchas gracias, Guillermo, y gracias a ti y al Instituto por todo lo que hacen a favor de la libertad y la democracia en nuestra región. Yo les pido disculpas también a ustedes, a los que hablan español, porque yo también preparé mis observaciones en inglés, pero entiendo que hay equipos de audio afuera para aquellos que necesitan traducción. There was a slight change in the agenda in the morning. So originally I was going to offer my remarks as an introduction, and logically they sort of make a bit more sense as an introduction. So I'd like to ask all of you if you could just sort of forget everything that you just heard from the panelists from this first panel and the former president of Ecuador. And then you can remember after I conclude my remarks. That way it'll make more sense. According to Spain's El País newspaper, the government of Argentina's attempted judicial reform is, quote, one of the most flagrant assaults on the separation of powers that can be remembered in a democracy. Human Rights Watch's José Miguel Vivanco has said that Venezuela's Supreme Justice Tribunal is, quote, devoid of the slightest credibility, being an appendage of the executive. And according to the nonprofit Permanent Assembly on Human Rights in Ecuador, quote, in recent months, the country has seen how the implementation of justice in Ecuador is plagued with weaknesses, errors, and extreme bias and subjectivity. Against these statements can be contrasted a quote by Venezuela's current Minister of Justice, who said, quote, I believe, even though it might appear to be a weakness, I think it was one of the great strengths of President Chavez to have always respected the Constitution and the laws, so that policies have always been within the framework of the law. The fact that the revolution came about via elections meant that we had to respect elections and laws, even while we gradually transformed these from a representative democracy to a participatory democracy. So today we've heard it, and we're going to hear more about the political use of the judiciary in Latin America. What I'd like to do is offer some brief remarks reflecting on the quotes that I just read, and to complement some of the specific examples that we heard, perhaps with a little bit of a theoretical framework. And I'd like to ask, what, if anything, is the unique significance of the trend that we've just heard of the political use of the judiciary in Latin America? Is it anything new? What's the innovation or the threat that this represents? Or is the Venezuelan minister who I just quoted right? Are these cases that we've heard about legitimate efforts to democratize the judicial sector and bring it closer to the people? Are these government actions consistent with the law? And if the minister is right, then what reason at all would there be for us to have heard these testimonies today, and for El País, José Miguel Vivanco, and the Permanent Assembly on Human Rights in Ecuador to say the things that they did? And of course, these aren't simple questions, but luckily I'm not the only one who's here to answer them. And part of the answer has to do with looking at the results that these types of policies and practices have had. And we've heard already about those. Clearly the record isn't a good one. We've heard about limits on freedom of expression, through which individuals can and have been imprisoned for criticizing their governments. Others have highlighted the shutting down of media, any media that's critical of governments, unless they agree to self-censor and begin to toe the official government line. Others have pointed to the fact that businesses are coming under harassment, extortion by tax authorities, and are even facing expropriation if the owners support opposition candidates or don't adapt to their government's wishes. And others have pointed out how elections are no longer free and fair when electoral tribunals are stacked in favor of the ruling party and the electoral tribunal's judges are members of the government's political party, and when their positions depend on the will of the government to keep them in office. And finally, of course, we can look at the accelerated immigration of people from a number of countries in Latin America. We here in the US, thankfully, have benefited from a lot of that. And not just immigration, but also political refugees, some of whom we have here with us today. And I can say that we're very grateful for having you here in this country. But this is obviously a great loss to Latin America. But while we can point to these results, some of which I've just indicated, but we could go on, the reality is that these types of violations are really nothing new in human history or unique to Latin America. In fact, for most of human history, I would argue that the person of the ruler and the judge have been the same. An absolute monarch or an absolute leader. And the individual had zero guarantee of any type of fair treatment before the law, if there was even a law that was codified that would help him to know what his rights are and safeguard them. And by the way, this is still the case in a number of primitive societies and tribal societies today. By the 17th and 18th centuries, in England, judges existed, but they were seen as the king's agents. They were just an extension of the executive. And they basically did his will, more or less directly, depending on the health of the judiciary at the time, but really on the inclinations of the individual monarch. And this was discussed by and described by Blackstone in his very famous commentaries on the laws of England. But we don't have to go beyond the region. Within Latin America itself, and even in recent memory, as we've heard, in recent history, Latin America's history is rich with examples of strongmen who apply the law according to the phrase that's much quoted and attributed alternatively to Benito Juárez or to Mexico or Oscar Benavides of Peru. Para mis amigos todo, para mis enemigos la ley. For my friends everything, for my enemies the law. And by the way, of course, Cuba remains an example of this today, where there isn't even the semblance that it's governed by anything other than a totalitarian dictatorship that concentrates power in the hands of a small few and that violently represses any form of dissent. Obviously, while this type of arbitrary concentrated power, I have argued, has been the norm, there were, of course, also exceptions throughout history. We know from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 15, Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 19, that even in biblical times, the notion of equality before the law and blind justice existed. And we have examples of Greek city-states, at least for those individuals who were citizens, considered to be citizens of those Greek city-states, from the Roman Republic, in which a mixed government was put in place modeled on Plato's notions of a republic. There were ideas that promoted the functioning of some type of independent judiciary. And the New Testament also makes the point. For example, Paul 1:17, Galatians 3:28, all talk about this. But while there have been these isolated examples, I would argue that it's liberal republican democracy, as first established by our founding fathers through the U.S. Constitution of 1787, and as explained by Madison in the Federalist Papers 51 and 78, and then the later contribution of judicial review through the Supreme Court decision Marbury versus Madison, which expressed the Supreme Court's duty to invalidate any law passed by the legislature, passed by a majority, that was contrary to the Constitution, that provides the best model for guaranteeing the rights of minorities in the face of the majority and the rights of the individual in the face of government. And it does so because it recognizes what John Locke explained were the fundamental natural rights to life, liberty, property, and as Jefferson expressed it, the pursuit of happiness. It's therefore in liberal democracy that man is regarded not as a means to be sacrificed for the good of the community or the state, as is the case in many other forms of government, but as an end in himself. And the role of government, therefore, is fundamentally to protect the individual's rights. And it's a judiciary that's independent of the other two branches of government that guarantees that the majority will not pass laws that infringe on these natural rights, that the individual enjoys not by virtue of being granted them by the government, but that are instead intrinsic to him, nor that the executive will concentrate power and subvert the political order for its own ends. Therefore, a judicial system, one that's not subject to political influence, is the cornerstone for guaranteeing the respect for individual liberty and human rights. And this is significant because it helps answer the question that I'd asked earlier. So, going back to that question, since history is full of examples of the types of violations on individual liberty and human rights that we're seeing as a result of the political use of the judiciary in Latin America today in so many countries, what, if anything, about the phenomenon is new and unique? What's the contribution that this phenomenon makes that we need to pay special attention to? And I'd like to suggest that what does make it qualitatively different can be found in the quote that I read by the Minister of Justice, but also reflected in the remarks of the former President of Ecuador and others on the panel. In other words, those political leaders who are today infringing on the judicial sector, unlike authoritarian populists that came in the past, unlike absolute monarchs from throughout history, unlike dictators that came from the military barracks in military fatigues, those who today are eroding individual liberties in the region are doing so by using the very institutions of liberal democracy: elections, the judiciary branch, legislatures, and laws, in order to subvert those very liberal democracies. In other words, they're using the same words of democracy, but they're giving them a very different content. They appeal to the same concepts of justice and individual rights and democracy, but these concepts are twisted until they become antithetical to their original meaning. They pay lip service to the forms and institutions of democracy while using the abstract concept of the people, referring to a majority or a large minority, to justify their concentration of power through which the government interprets what the will is of that majority. And this is what gives this phenomenon that we're seeing something new, a new aspect, and something that's much more difficult to identify and detect until, unfortunately, it's often too late. And this is what makes it more difficult to challenge, and also to rally a society to defend against the erosion of their rights through this means. By appealing to popular sentiment and speaking the language of the poor and the disenfranchised, of course, one of the principal dangers that this presents is the potential for it to devolve into what's been called a tyranny of the majority. This isn't a new concept, and in fact, it was one of the principal dangers that was warned to us even by Plato, but also by such thinkers as Locke, Mill, de Tocqueville, and several others. It's not an exaggeration to say that this form of government, of which we're already seeing some hints of development in a few countries in Latin America, when combined with the extensive resources of the modern state that far surpass those that existed when these thinkers were alive, and combined with the control of the mass media, if it's left unchecked, has the potential to become even more pernicious and more devastating than tyranny at the hands of even an absolute monarch. The instrument that's used to amass this power and to remove checks on the executive is precisely bringing the judiciary under the absolute control. This political use of the judicial system, the subject of our conference, is therefore one of the most formidable enemies of liberty in Latin America today. And it begins, as Montesquieu said, with the decay of a society's democratic principles, but it continues with a concentration of power in an executive whose authority becomes unchecked by the independent judiciary that should be its built-in counterweight. A few blocks away from where we're meeting today, above the entrance to the Supreme Court, is an inscription that reads, "Equal justice under the law." There's a Statue of Liberty that's depicted as being blind above that. Justice is not in service to anyone in particular. That's the point. What the trend that we've heard of today represents, however, is justice redefined and at the service of a group, of one group. And when justice is at the service of some, this is the subversion of justice for everyone else, even for the majority. And that's why it's important to have individuals like those that we've been hearing from today. And that's why it's important to have meetings like this to center more attention on this issue. And that's why it's important to continue to support those within these countries in Latin America who are experiencing this erosion of judicial independence, to be able to elevate the issue and be able to counter this trend. So thank you again for your attention. Thanks very much for inviting me.